Please welcome LISC board member Catherine Merchant.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you here in Houston. It's my privilege to introduce LISC's longtime board chairman, Bob Rubin. Bob has been among the most influential economic forces in our country for the last 40 years. He began this part of his career in 1966 in private finance at Goldman Sachs. Depending on how old you are, however, you may know him best for his public service record during the Clinton administration, Bill Clinton, that is, including serving as inaugural director of the National Economic Council in 1993 and Secretary of the Treasury from 1995 to 1999. While he shaped many policies and programs that are still helping to drive our work in low-income communities, today, the New Markets Tax Credit stands out as a particular major legacy. In 1999, Bob returned to the civilian world for a decade of private finance as a director and senior advisor at Citi, but he has remained intently focused on public policy. For example, in 2006, he was one of the founders of the Hamilton Project, at the Brookings Institution. The project is named after Alexander Hamilton, the nation's first Treasury Secretary, who laid the foundation for the modern American economy. Now, as an aside, anyone who has seen the smash Broadway hit knows that Hamilton is also credited with a major role in creating the Electoral College, a rather hot topic this week. So, a year later, Bob joined the Council on Foreign Relations, where he currently serves as co-chair. And that is just the tip of the iceberg. What might be less well known to the general public is Bob's deep commitment to the work we all do as partners in LISC across the United States. When Bob stepped away from government service in 1999, one of the first things he did was join the LISC board as chairman. Bob still recalls vividly the story of walking through neighborhoods in the Bronx and Los Angeles in the late 1990s, seeing what LISC's work looked like on the ground, just like we are today, and becoming energized by what we could accomplish together. Throughout these 17 years, Bob has advocated that investments in low-income people and places is fundamental to our national interest. He believes that the cost of not doing so, both in economic and human terms, is simply too high. We will soon have a new administration in the White House. I would like to recycle a quote attributed to President Bill Clinton during Bob's tenure as Treasury Secretary. What we've got to do is get up tomorrow and go back to work, just like we did today. Make good things happen, trust the system, and trust the American people. It's going to be fine. Bob, thank you for your commitment to hopeful progress, and I'm hoping for an echo of that message today. Please let me introduce Bob Rubin.
Thank you, Kathy. Let me add my welcome to Kathy's, to all of you, and also let me say it's an honor to be with you, as it has been an honor to be part of LISC since I first became chairman of the board. I said to Maurice, when you look around this room, this is America, and unfortunately that's not necessarily recognized by all of those who are about to govern us. We're meeting at a troubling time. Most of you have been involved in community development for a long time, as have I, and we certainly now face challenges on multiple fronts that are worrying and are going to require all of us to focus with enormous intensity and effort. Looking back for a moment, in 1995, shortly after I became Treasury Secretary, we set up the first community development office in the United States Treasury. A few months later, a senior United States senator called me to his office, and he said, "You have no business being involved with these social issues. You're Secretary of the Treasury, and you should worry about economic issues." I said, I didn't feel that respectful, but as a senior United States senator, I respectfully disagree, Senator. Poverty and community development are critical economic issues. What I should have added but didn't is that what he was referring to as social programs are public investments, and they're public investments with a high rate of return. And now more than ever, it seems to me that we must make the case that these programs that are our mission are an economic imperative and that they are indeed public investments with a high return. What most people don't realize is that poverty, as a profoundly important economic issue, affects not only the poor, but affects all of us, no matter where we live or what our incomes may be. The social cost that could be saved and the productivity that could be gained if we equipped the poor to enter the economic mainstream successfully could be enormous and could contribute greatly to our country's competitiveness in a time of increasing global competition. And I might add that the same thing can be said, though it's not the subject of today's conference, of criminal justice reform, which I think is absolutely imperative. Living in New York, I might add, is that I gave a TEDx speech at San Quentin in January, which is going to be on YouTube, I think, in the next few weeks, once the warden continues his process of editing it to make sure I didn't say anything that was terrible or something. Anyway, when I lived in New York in the 1970s, I became increasingly troubled as I became ever more aware of the difficult conditions of the people who lived not much north of where I was. I'm a reader, and at some point in 1982, I picked up a book by Ken Aletta. And what he did was to describe the replication of poverty through generations. 34 years have passed since Ken wrote that gripping book. But the intergenerational cycle of poverty stubbornly persists. The poverty rate, as all of you know, is about 13.5% of the population, and the child poverty rate, the children's poverty rate, is close to 20%. And that is a moral outrage for the richest country in the world. It is also an immense impediment with respect to our economic future. The politics of combating poverty, and I've been involved in those politics for a long time, as have many of you, have always been difficult. And they're going to get more difficult, as we all know, after last week's election. Two powerful factors that feed those difficulties are, one, the failure of most people in America to realize that we are all seriously affected by poverty, not just the poor. And secondly, the mistaken notion that nothing works. All of us in this room know that there are many programs that work, government programs, non-governmental programs, and programs involving the private sector. As Kathy said, I first heard about LISC when I went for a tour of the South Bronx, and again, as Kathy just described, it was a remarkable experience to see this vast amount of renovated housing and revived neighborhood. It involved the city, it involved the private sector, and of course it involved LISC, operating primarily with the low-income housing tax credit. So, when I left Treasury and there was the opportunity to become chairman of LISC, that was the first decision I made. And it was also the best decision I made in my post-Treasury life. In the years that I've been on the board, I've developed enormous respect for this work, for the people at LISC, and for all that's been accomplished. Last year alone, LISC provided $1.3 billion in financing to inner cities and to poor rural areas. Our success reflected the leadership, long-time leadership, of our CEO, Michael Rubin. When he decided about 6 months ago to retire, we began an extensive search process, and we had some outstandingly good candidates. In the course of that process, we were very fortunate, and we were able to recruit a truly outstanding, and I do mean truly outstanding, new CEO, Maurice Jones, who I now have the pleasure of introducing. Maurice's life story, some of which he'll share with you this afternoon, is truly compelling. He was raised by grandparents who not only didn't attend college, but didn't even attend high school. He was raised on a tobacco farm in Southwest Virginia, and he went on to become valedictorian of his college, Hampton-Sydney College, a Rhodes Scholar, a graduate of the University of Virginia Law School, and highly successful in government and the private sector. He held 2 senior posts in the government of the Commonwealth of Virginia. He was Deputy Secretary to Sean Donovan at HUD, and he both practiced law and ran a newspaper company. He's a skilled manager, and he has deep knowledge of and passion for the issues that animate LISC's work. Now, more than ever, the country needs LISC, and the country needs its dynamic new leader, Maurice Jones. Please welcome to the stage our new CEO, Maurice.
Well, good afternoon to everybody. Now, I know there are more people than that in the room. All right, we'll try this again. You know, I'm from the South. In the South, when you say good afternoon, everybody embraces you. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. All right. Nice to be with you. Thank you. The secretary has asked me to call him Bob. I'm getting there. But when I first met him, I had an afro, and he was Secretary Rubin. At least one of those things has changed. Wait, that wasn't a joke. No. It is nice to be with you. I want to first just thank Amanda and the great LISC team here in Houston. The last couple of days, they have been tutoring me and others, and this morning we had a great tour where we saw the work that you all are working on and the partners that you're working with, and it's good stuff. I want to also thank all of our partners who have come here to be with us for these few days. We obviously cannot do any of our work or do it well without partners, so let's give a hand for LISC's partners. I want to thank all of the remainder of the LISC staff who are here. Particularly, I want to say thank you for welcoming me and for the lessons that you've already taught me and the lessons that you will teach me. So thank you to the LISC staff. That includes also Bob and the rest of the board. I also want to thank the board for all of the service that they give us. And then lastly, and most especially, I want to thank all of the residents of the neighborhoods in which we work. At the end of the day, our work is really small potatoes compared to their ability every day to get up and do it again. To get up and put food on the table for their children or grandchildren, go to 1, 2, maybe 3 jobs for which it's a struggle in many cases for them just to arrive on time because of transportation challenges. In some cases, living in houses that are not the healthiest, or at least as healthy as you and I would have for our children. I want to thank the residents that we work with, and I want to affirm that just as we were faithful to these residents before Election Day, we will remain faithful after Election Day. That's our pledge, right? So I thought what I would do, I've been on the job now a little over 60 days. And the beauty of that is it gives me the chance to say stuff about which I know very little about. And you'll forgive me if I get it wrong, right? Right? All right. And you'll correct me if I get it wrong, right? Let me give you some reflections after 60 days on the job. And let me start first with the assets that I see in the, for lack of a better description, I'm going to call all of us the LISC family, because that's what we are. Let me start with the assets. The first obvious asset we have is capital. You have heard how we just last year invested, just LISC alone, about $1.3 billion or so. We, with our partners over a 40-year period, we invested about $16 billion and leveraged another $48 billion. So close to $60 billion have flowed into many tough neighborhoods across the country as a result of our work with our partners in the last 40 years. So capital is one big asset. Another asset are the people that are involved in our work. The people at LISC, the people that we have in our partners. Can't beat the people. We saw some of these people this morning on the tour. A third asset, and one that I was aware of before coming, but that has been highlighted for me since being here, is our, if you will, delivery system. We are in ourselves 31 locations. We have multiple other partners that enable us to work in 40 states in the rural parts of the country. I hate to say it this way, but we are analogous to the Walmart of community development. It maybe should be Starbucks, right? We got a store on every corner. Although I'll come back to this, there are some corners where we're not, where I hope we will look to go. But our delivery system is second to none in our reach across the country. Our expertise and our experience doing this for 40 years, we've learned something. Our data. We have data in 31 places plus on the work that we've been doing across the country in the various spaces. That is a huge asset. It's an asset that, just as a footnote, is probably unrealized right now. And I'll come back to that. Our presence in multiple markets, like Houston, enables us to build market discipline muscles. We are, even though folks might not associate with us, this with us as much as they used to, we're an entrepreneurial entity that has to respond to the opportunities and the partners in multiple markets. And that is an incredible, incredible muscle. Our comprehensive model, I believe, is an asset. And then lastly, our track record. We hit on some of this, but $16.2 billion, $48 billion leveraged. In the communities where we are most engaged, and I think some of you know this, but in the communities where we've done our most intensive work, we have seen a 9% increase in wages and employment as compared to those communities where we are not working. For folks who wonder about whether this works, give them that data point. 9% more in wages, 9% more in jobs in the places where we are most heavily engaged as compared to census tracts communities similarly situated where we're not engaged. 350,000 affordable homes built, 56 million square feet of commercial space and recreation space and community space, over 1,500 child care centers, et cetera. Those are all assets for us, all assets. Assets that we need to make sure every day we're asking ourselves, how are we maximizing them for the benefit of the communities that we're serving? Now, how about the risk? There are risks. One risk that I notice as I am going around is sometimes our expectations for impact for our communities are not as big as I'd like for them to be. I believe that that is because of our experience, right? We know how tough the work is. But I think we always have to ask ourselves how much of who we are is determined by our experience and how much of who we are is determined by our expectations. And let me submit to you, as a little country boy growing up in a place where the expectation was for me to graduate from high school and go to work at a sawmill or a tobacco farm or, at that time, a textile plant, that I am really, really glad that my teachers and my grandparents and my coaches and other folks who influenced me had other expectations of me that at the end of the day I ended up internalizing. One of our jobs has to be, I believe, to maintain high expectations for every person in every community where we work, even when experience would suggest otherwise. One of the lessons of this election season, and as my pastor would say, now I'm going to go to meddling. But one of the lessons for me of this election season is that we will live into the expectations that influential folks set for us. Right? I mean, look at the debate of this season. Look at the behavior that was talked about. I mean, I was fearful of letting my 14-year-old daughter watch CNN at night. But we lived into expectations that were set for us in this season. And that's just a human response. Our job is to always have high expectations for our work and for the people that we work for, and to always fight to make sure that everybody else has those expectations too. The moment we start having low expectations, imagine the expectations that those who don't know as much about the folks will have. We are the most schooled on the people we serve. And we have to keep our expectations high in spite or in the face of experience. That's a great risk for us, a risk that I'm hopeful we can continue to talk about as time goes on. The second risk I see is the risk that our work will get disconnected from the story that the Secretary told. The work that we're doing needs to be put into the American story. A story right now of a country that's growing low-wage jobs at 4 times the rate we're growing middle to high-wage jobs. A story of a country that in the last decade plus lost hundreds of thousands of manufacturing jobs that were the bedrock of folks in our communities. A story of a country now whose comparative advantage is shifting very quickly to technology, to knowledge. Our communities are within that story. Our communities have been impacted by that story. Our communities need to remain in the story of how America adjusts to the new global economic realities. Our communities need to be prepared to compete for the opportunities of the 21st century America, and they're there. But our communities are not disconnected from the American story. They are the American story. You can't understand the American story without understanding our communities. It's up to us, though, to make sure people don't see this as a footnote in the story, but as center page of what's happening in America and what we need to do to stay competitive in the world. And as I talk to folks more and more, I'm fearful of our communities getting, if you will, relegated to a footnote. A footnote that, for those with heart and those who are thinking about, if you will, charity and social services, they'll be moved to do something about it. But we need to make sure that people understand that what is happening in America is reflected writ large in the places where we're working. Absent that, what we're trying to do in mobilizing partners for the work will be an uphill climb. The last piece, the last risk I'll mention now, is the risk of speed or lack thereof. Now, I know our work tends to take some time to show results, no question about it. But the competition is moving at a rapid pace. And when I say the competition, I mean the economic forces in particular that are impacting our neighborhoods. That's our competition. And so we've got to find ways to speed our work, to accelerate our work to results. We need to do that to build more of a coalition for the work, but we also need to do that because of the competitive forces that we are battling against, if you will, if you want to think of it that way. Those risks are risks that we can all work on together. They're risks, though, that we have to acknowledge and be prepared to do something about. So let me suggest, as I get ready to leave, 2 or 3 refinements to, I think, what you're going to see LISC pursuing as a result of these opportunities or these assets and these risks. First thing, with partners, lots of them, I want to see us really, really go boldly into the living wage job creation space for our residents. You can clap for that, actually. This one, we have to take on with gusto. If we don't make significant progress in this one, all of the other areas where we work, housing and safety and health, their fragility is just exacerbated. Our folks need, first and foremost, living wage jobs so they can pay their bills, so they can move if they desire. That piece of our work is a piece that we're doing some work on now, work that we can use to move forward on, but work that we need to enlarge and scale and add to, which means we need to add capacity and tools and capital and talent. But that's work that there's not been a place I've visited yet where that work is not needed. There are few places, given the assets that we have, that have the opportunity to do it the way that we can. If we're going to do economic development work, job creation work, at a level that is material, we're going to need more state and local partners. We're going to need more partners in the state and local governments in particular, which is where significant assets reside for economic development, which means for us as LISC that in addition to focusing on national policy, we're going to have to focus more on state and local. Again, I think that's capacity that we'll need to add to do that. I haven't been to a place yet where people have not commented on the need for more talent in the form of community leadership. We're doing some work around that now, but that is also an area where we will need to up our game, if you will. And we particularly need leaders of color and women and young folks. We need people who look like the communities in which we work, right? We at LISC need leaders who look like the places where we work as well. So this issue of community leadership, which we have already done significant work in, remains on the agenda and remains one of the most strategic ways to impact the destiny of the places that we're trying to serve. We now need to work with partners to figure out how now, given where we are in our neighborhoods and in our country, and as a network, how now we put some strategies in place to build more excellent community leaders. I think, and this may be naive, but I think our rural work may get a boost from this election. May. I can't tell. There's one can for that. There's no question that folks from rural America came out to vote this time, right? There's no question also that folks from rural America are feeling the economic shifts and are unhappy about the economic shifts and are feeling pain points about the economic shifts like few others. We're already doing the work. We work in places now, I think of the 6.7 million people living in the census tracts where we work, 1.2 million are in rural America. I was about to say rural Virginia, right? Not quite that many in rural Virginia. 1,200 in my town, though, right? But I think one of our opportunities may very well be to utilize that asset, both for the benefit of the work we do in rural America, but also for the benefit of the brand that is LISC. We are one of the few places, actually we may be the only intermediary that's working in both urban and rural America. That's an opportunity for us and an area where we're going to do some work. Last point I want to make. These relationships we have, these assets, are tremendous. They, as I say, they span the whole country. The question is what we do with them. The question is how audacious we will be with this network. I would submit to you that what we have a chance to do, and this would surprise folks, and it ought to. What we have a chance to do now is to use this network here to try to influence a national agenda that talks about living wage jobs for all people, particularly poor people. We create 2 million jobs a year or so in the US, right? We ought to pick a spot on the wall that X percent, and I won't pick that spot now, but X percent of the living wage jobs created every year will go to low-income folks, right? And use this network to literally mobilize an agenda that becomes public, that gets written about, that gets talked about, that gets embraced by the localities where we work. That's the power of a network like this. We can actually influence an item that can become a national agenda. Did you know, and I didn't know this, I'm from the Virginia area. If you live, or I'll put it another way, if you're born in Arlington, Virginia, your life expectancy is 86. You're expected to live 86 years just by virtue of being born in Arlington, Virginia. Now, I love Arlington, don't get me wrong. It's all good. If you're born 7 miles away across the Potomac in Washington, D.C., your life expectancy is 8 years less than that. 6 years less than that. Let me see if my math is right. Yeah, 86 in Arlington, 78 in D.C. In fact, it gets even trickier. In parts of Kansas City, if you're born on one side of the highway versus being born on the other, your life expectancy is more than 10 years less. I see an audacious aspiration for our country, that we close this life expectancy gap within the next fill in the blank. It is a reflection of poverty and opportunity, pure and simple. We need to do those kinds of things with our network. Utilize this network to set audacious goals for the country with respect to the people in the communities where we serve. Poor people, people of color, immigrants. That's our opportunity. These relationships that we have, in addition to every day doing the work, we've got to influence the overall environment within which we work. We've got to work to make sure that the folks that we care about, that we work for, are prioritized, and that there are specific, quantifiable priorities with respect to them. Now is the time for us to pursue these kinds of aspirations for our communities. Not later, now, when folks probably least expect it. Folks expect us to be quiet now. This is the wrong answer. We ought to be louder than ever, but in a constructive way. But in a constructive way, right? Put our people on the agenda. Largely, our partners in the business community right now are in the banking and financial services sectors. I love all bankers, don't get me wrong. But we have to do more to bring more people from more business sectors to our tables, right? Manufacturing and technology and healthcare. All of these folks have an interest in the people and the communities that we're serving. We've got to do more to get them to the table. We need to use this network to reach out and diversify our coalition. The Secretary mentioned I was raised by grandparents. My daughter teases me. Our hometown was 1,200 people, smaller than her school. My grandfather was probably the most influential person in my upbringing. And he was the best man at my wedding. He got sick when he was 85 years old. They took him to a hospital. The nearest big hospital for us was 90 minutes away from my hometown. They rushed him in, and I met him in the emergency room, and the doctors pulled me aside, and the doctor looked at me and said, "Your grandfather's very sick. He has something called bacteria meningitis. A bacteria had entered his right eye and traveled down the optic nerve and lodged in the meninges, the membrane surrounding the brain." Trust me, I'm not a doctor. I knew nothing about this stuff until that night. But the doctor said to me, he said, "Listen, if your grandfather were 45, I'd tell you he's not going to make it." He said, "We don't have any documented cases of an 85-year-old surviving, and so I need to prepare you for his death." Well, that was tough news for me. This was the closest guy to me, without a doubt. So I said, "Well, what can you do?" And he said, "Not much. We'll give him an antibiotic, and the rest is up to him." And I said, well, that's fine. I said, this is a tough country, boy. I said, you do what you have to do, and let's see what happens. And they gave him this antibiotic, and I said, can I stay with him? And they had us there in an intensive care unit, and they put all these clothes on me that supposedly protected me from this infection that he had. And the doctor said, listen, your grandfather is going to fall into a deep comatose state. He said he's not going to be responsive. He said this bacteria is eating away at his brain. He said, I just want to let you know what's going to happen. He said, we're going to put him on all the life support we have. He said, but you're going to have to make a decision about how much you want us to intervene. And I said, listen, my grandfather, don't do anything basically that's unusual, out of the ordinary. We care about the quality of his life. But I said, I told you this is a tough country, boy. He said, okay. In the middle of the night, after everything had happened, put a tube down his throat so he could breathe. They gave him medication so his heart rate would be normal, so to speak. They put him on all kinds of medication, just keeping his vital organs alive, working while the antibiotic did whatever it was going to do. In the middle of the night, the doctor comes in, and the doctor says, I don't want to give you any false hope, but the bacteria entered that right eye. We think we should remove that eye. It may give him a slight chance, but honestly, we don't want to raise your expectations. I said, I'll take the slight chance. So they removed his eye, they brought him back in. He remained the same. I was sitting there. After a while, I prayed and I fell off to sleep. And it may be 45 minutes. I woke up. And something moved me to call my grandfather's name. There was a nurse in there giving him more of the antibiotic. And so I called his name, and he answered. And the nurse turned around and she said, did you say something? I said, no, but my grandfather did. You better go get that doctor. And so she ran off and got the doctor, and the doctor came in, and the doctor examined my grandfather, and the doctor looked at me and he said to me, he said, I can't explain it medically, but he's going to make it. And then slowly over 2 or 3 hours, they removed all these artificial means of keeping my grandfather alive. And at that point, I realized he was going to make it. And so I go to the doctor. I said, Doc, what do we do about the eye? The doctor, in his wisdom, said, I've done my part, now you do your part. I went to my grandfather and I said, Gramps, I said, you were sick. You were very sick. I said, we weren't sure you were going to make it. I said, but, you know, I had faith. And he looked up at me and he said, boy, and he could barely talk because they had a tube in his throat, so he was hoarse. He said, boy, anybody who tells you that they don't want to live until they're 86, he said, they ain't 85 yet. I said, that's probably right. I said, Gramps, I said, you had an infection in your eye. And I said, we had to remove your eye to give you a chance to wake up and to go back home. And he looked at me without a pause, and he said, "That's all right." He said, "I couldn't see out of that eye anyway." He lived for 10 more years. That's the spirit for us. Anybody who says they don't want to live until they're 86, they ain't 85 yet, right? We cannot be weary. We cannot be weary. We have to keep on getting up. And this stamina, this was, by the way, just another lesson at my grandfather's feet in stamina, in grace, courage, and just a pure heart and will to beat expectations. When he went into that hospital, he expected that I was going to take him out of it. And that was all there was. And because he expected it, I did. When I met him at the door, we exchanged words. And I expected to take him home. And that's what I did. We have to make sure that we expect to take our communities home and that we inspire others to expect to help us do it. I'm grateful for all you do. Thanks. Thank you. That's kind. Thank you. Thank you. I know I'm supposed to tell folks to stay right here, right? The TED Talks begin next. We have a little break. I didn't expect to get emotional, so I apologize for that. But thanks.